So let's go ahead and move on to section 2, which is on teaching listening. And this covers chapters 7 through 10. The second section begins with an overview of approaches for teaching listening, and it covers several hypotheses that have informed teaching approaches. And these hypotheses include the effective filter hypothesis, the input hypothesis, the interaction hypothesis, the processability hypothesis, the metacognition hypothesis, the sociocultural hypothesis, which is based on sociocultural theory, and the active listening hypothesis. So I'm not going to go into all the details of these hypotheses right here, but I will say that Rost encourages a balanced approach. And the end of chapter 7 includes a bullet point list of examples of strategies that teachers can do, including providing lots of input with tech supports to enhance the input and promote comprehension, including tasks that have collaboration and negotiation of meaning, and then pushed output, and where you make students write exactly what they have understood, or they are forced to notice new language or new cultural elements, and also some strategy training. And Rost recommends that we personalize the listening experience. We have learners who come to our classes and they have different learning styles, so we want to vary how we try to reach them with as many tasks as possible. And chapter 8 discusses the selection and use of listening input techniques that we as teachers have available to us. And one of these is using discourse genres to help our students understand what is happening in typical spoken language events. So, for example, one of the thoughts that crossed my mind was in a talk show format on TV, there's a typical progression that the interview format goes through. And then the same thing for a sports interview, for example, or a TV news presentation. And for native speakers, there's an expectation, a cultural anticipation of what's going to take place when we watch one of these genres. So we want to teach these to our second language learners because nobody goes into a listening event without some type of understanding of what's about to take place or a framework for the interaction in a speaking event. So we want to lighten the cognitive load for our students. And in real life, we all enter listening situations with an understanding of the context. And native speakers learn to identify these genres intuitively or through explicit study. So then chapter 9 deals with how to design instruction for listening. And it details how to develop listening skills through intensive listening, where you focus on the phonology and syntax and lexis, and the learner pays close attention to what is actually said. And there's teacher feedback on accuracy. And then selective listening, where you focus on the main ideas. And then interactive listening, where you focus on becoming active as a listener and attempt to clarify meaning or form, and the learner interacts verbally with others in collaborative tasks. And extensive listening, where you focus on listening continuously for a longer time and try to manage larger amounts of listening input. And then autonomous listening, where the listener focuses on managing their own progress and works on becoming an independent listener. So there's plenty in this chapter, and ideas from practitioners concerning how to prepare lessons, utilize graphic organizers, encourage note-taking, implement dictation, focus on different learning tasks and media, and considerations for how to encourage autonomous listening. And Rost again ends with a recommendation to use multiple approaches, but also adapt to particular students and their interests and needs. And then chapter 10 is on assessment and listening. And there's a lot that could be said here, but I'll just say that he covers assessment concepts such as validity, listening constructs, the washback effect, and other issues related to testing listening. And these assessment concepts are, of course, important to address whenever you talk about assessment. And the big takeaways I get from this chapter are that he encourages assessments that are constructed based on phonological, lexical, syntactic, pragmatic, and general listening processes and skills. And then he also applies Bloom's taxonomy levels, as well as the Council of Europe scale. And these are tools that can help us describe listener proficiencies and build a model for assessment. Ultimately, he acknowledges that assessing listening fully is not easy. And a big reason why is that listening is a cognitive skill, and so it needs to be tested indirectly. So at the end of the chapter, he encourages us to use portfolio style assessments in addition to multiple choice, dictation, and other closed tasks. So in those portfolios, perhaps we could include interviews or communicative and collaborative tasks that we do in class and projects. So we are able to get a full picture of the listener's abilities. Well, that concludes section 2. There's much more there in the book, but for the sake of time, let's move on to section 3. So section 3 is finally the researching listening section. There's chapters 11 through 12 and 13. In this section's introduction, Rost states that the section explores avenues of exploring listening on a personal level, as a student of listening, and as a researcher of listening. And there are 3 chapters in here which each describe 3 different orientation frameworks that researchers can use to explore listening. There's the sociolinguistic orientation, the psycholinguistic orientation, and then the developmental orientation. And the way that Rost explains these orientations is that he gives a conceptual framework and then implements a project plan to give recommendations for how to go about doing a similar research study. And then he gives samples and examples of data and real studies that have been done before. So the first project in the sociolinguistic orientation explores a doctor-patient encounter between a genetic counselor and a female client with her husband, and they're discussing the couple's interest in a fertility testing procedure. And the book demonstrates data in the form of 2 transcript extracts, and then follows with an analysis of the data. And the analysis here in this section is a dissection of the different roles that all of these people play: the genetic counselor, the female client, and then her husband. And it analyzes their responses to each other as an example of listening in context and being pragmatic and co-constructing language together. And the main takeaway I took from this section is just the example of the transcript. It's another good model of a way to write a transcript of an interaction and then analyze that data for different purposes. So then the second project in this section was about listening in multilingual interactions, and this was much more appealing to me. It was an interaction between a homestay mother who was a fluent English speaker and then a homestay student who is a native Japanese speaker. And the transcript of their interaction shows that the Japanese speaker wants to borrow a warm jacket for the cold New Zealand weather, and the homestay mother misinterprets what he's saying. She misunderstands his broken English, and as the conversation takes some interesting couple little turns, even though it's very short. And eventually the homestay student is able to get permission to borrow a warm jacket from the homestay mother, but it takes them a little while to get on the same page and for the homestay mother to understand what it is the student wants. So I enjoyed that little example study. And the end of the chapter on the sociolinguistic orientation encourages us not to overlook the social dimension of language when we are researching listening. So then chapter 12 discusses research projects that are based on psycholinguistic orientations. And a psycholinguistic orientation focuses on the listener's cognitive processing and how the listener builds meaning and experiences perception and decoding of input and comprehends messages and draws on memory. And the first study is a selection from a classic memory study in which there's a story that is told to listeners called The War of the Ghosts. And the story has unfamiliar characters and story structures, and then the listeners listen to the story and then need to recall the story. So the first time they are asked an open-ended question, just tell me what you heard in the story. And then the second time they are asked more directed questions that are specific to details within the story and comprehension questions. So then their recall is transcribed and then the data is analyzed. And this is another study that I enjoyed, and I would like to do something like this perhaps sometime. And it reminded me of the task that we did where we had to have our a second language learner recall a text and analyze and share about what is their process in reading the text. And then the next part of the chapter on the psycholinguistic orientation looks at research on causes of misunderstanding in 5 data samples of short misunderstandings about words, syntax, phrases, situational routines, and social norms, and other types of misunderstandings. And then there's a project plan for researchers to collect multiple examples of misunderstandings from a variety of sources, and then record the data on these misunderstanding cards. And Rost highlights the fact that we all experience misunderstandings quite regularly, but for second language learners and listeners, misunderstandings are sometimes more noticeable because of their adverse effects. And this is a study that I would like to participate in sometime, or at least I think it would be interesting to collect data on misunderstandings that occur and what are the types of misunderstandings that second language learners experience. And then chapter 13 explores 2 sample research projects that are based on developmental orientations, and developmental orientations focus on how a person's listening ability develops over time. The first project looks at different combinations of listening interventions in academic listening and their effects on learners' motivation, learning strategies, listening performance, and the students' demonstration of content mastery. So of course this is very practical for us as language teachers. And at the end, the researchers analyzed student questionnaires that were triangulated with other objective measures of learner progress. And the researchers conclude that test taking practice and guided discussion groups were key activities that should be emphasized in courses dealing with academic listening. And then there's a project plan for doing similar research. So that's another project that I'd be interested in doing, and I'm actually doing something a little similar for my research project, my action research project this year. And then the final research project is a project plan for designing an autonomous listening course. And the purpose of this is to create opportunities for students to do listening activities on their own. And this is something I'm really interested in, and am doing my action research also to encourage this type of listening. And the book gives an overview of how to plan for the orientation, and there are recommendations and resources for selecting materials for an autonomous listening course, and then also developing listening tasks that prompt students to do tasks at different levels of Bloom's taxonomy on their own, independently, in a listening self-access center. And then there's also technical support. And then there are recommendations for how to set this up. And there are recommendations for recommended films, and then for comprehension questions and dictation tasks, transcripts, and so on and so forth. So that's it for the section on researching listening. Of course, this is just a quick summary, but that ends section 3. And then section 4 is on exploring listening, and there's a glossary and an index. The section on resources for further explanation includes online games, online content, and online language courses, listening journals, listening technologies, listening and conflict resolution resources, listening therapy. And then at the very end, there are a couple little comments on listening in Western philosophy and listening in Eastern philosophy. Interesting. It ends with a statement about Buddhism. So my concluding thoughts: as a whole, I feel much better equipped to teach listening skills after reading this book, and I feel much better equipped to do research in this area of language. I was surprised by the heavy linguistic emphasis, but although the terminology and concepts were challenging to absorb, and I'm still absorbing them, I appreciate the depth of knowledge that I've gained by reading this text. I'm still digesting it and trying to absorb everything it has to offer. But I am encouraged to continue pursuing my own action research and listening activities in my own classroom. And in my own teaching and research, I am most interested in applying the concepts from the research projects from chapter 13. And there are plenty of good recommendations, so I highly recommend the book. It's a challenge, but it's well worth the read. So I'll close with my discussion questions. The first one is, how do you define listening skills? You can use concepts from this or from other background knowledge that you have. Another one is, how do you teach listening and help your students develop in their listening? And what are your takeaways from this presentation in terms of teaching applications? And then, which of the research projects from section 3 did you find interesting? How would you try them out for yourself? And which of the orientations appeal to you and why? So thank you for listening, and I hope you learned something about listening.